Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, depression settled over the loyal people of the United States following the devastating loss at the Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. It caused much hand wringing and finger pointing. Many of the best generals in the old U.S. Army, including Robert E. Lee, had followed their southern homelands out of the Union when the ordinances of secession were passed. And what of those who were left to fight for the Stars and Stripes? Irvin McDowell had been at the helm of the Army, the Union Army at Bull Run, and he bore the responsibility for the embarrassing rout of his men in that great skedaddle back to the relative safety of the defenses of Washington, D.C. General Winfield Scott, the hero of other wars, Mexico, and before that, the War of 1812, he was now aged and infirm. There's no way that he could hack the rigors of life in the saddle. Who would the nation look to pick up the floundering fortunes of the government of, by, and for the people? What general had the skill, the courage, the experience, and the charisma to bring out the natural gifts of the country's citizen soldiers and retake the momentum from the rebels? Who? Well, there was one man perfectly fit for the job, a young military leader to rebuild the country's fortunes. You students of the Civil War know him immediately by his photograph, George Brinton McClellan, a son of prominent Philadelphia physician and his wife, West Point class of 1846, breveted twice during the war with Mexico, an observer of European armies during the Crimean War, author of a cavalry manual and a widely adopted saddle, and most recently, leader of operations in Western Virginia that resulted in victories at places named Philippi and Rich Mountain and Beverly. McClellan's operations ended with the death of one Confederate senior officer, Brigadier General Robert S. Garnett, and the capture of another, Brigadier General John Pegram. These wins helped bring Western Virginia under Union control. McClellan is fairly called the hero of West Virginia. Just a few days before the stinging loss by Irvin McDowell at Bull Run, McClellan issued a congratulatory address to his command. Let me read it to you. Headquarters, Army of Occupation, Western Virginia, Beverly, Virginia, July 19th, 1861. Soldiers of the Army of the West. I am more than satisfied with you. You have annihilated two armies commanded by educated and experienced soldiers entrenched in mountain fastnesses and fortified at their leisure. You have taken 5 guns, 12 colors, 1,500 stand of arms, 1,000 prisoners, including more than 40 officers. One of the second commanders of the rebels is a prisoner. The other lost his life on the field of battle. You have killed more than 250 of the enemy, who has lost all baggage and camp equipage. All this has been accomplished with the loss of 20 brave men killed and 60 wounded on your part. You have proved that Union men fighting for the preservation of our government are more than a match for our misguided and erring brothers. More than this, you have shown mercy to the vanquished. You have made long and arduous marches with insufficient food, frequently exposed to the inclemency of the weather. I've not hesitated to demand this of you, feeling that I could rely on your endurance, patriotism, and courage. In the future, I may have still greater demands to make upon you, still greater sacrifices for you to offer. It shall be my care to provide for you to the extent of my ability, but I know now that by your valor and endurance, you will accomplish all that is asked. Soldiers, I have confidence in you, and I trust you have learned to confide in me. Remember that discipline and subordination are qualities of equal value with courage. I'm proud to say that you have gained the highest reward that American troops can receive. the thanks of Congress, and the applause of your fellow citizens. George B. McClellan, Major General. There's more. A wartime biography published in 1864 during his presidential campaign to deprive Abraham Lincoln from a second term in the White House offered this account of McClellan's popular rise to power from his successes in West Virginia to command of the Army of the Potomac. So let me read this to you. While these events had been transacting in Western Virginia, the Battle of Bull Run had been fought and lost by the loyal army. The scene that ensued at Washington City will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. On Sunday night, the inhabitants had retired to their beds, cheered by intelligence from the field that a decisive victory was certain. They woke to learn that McDowell had suffered a terrible defeat. When they opened their windows to the light, they saw the streets crowded with demoralized soldiers. As the day wore on, the first sentiments of alarm and terror were increased instead of diminished. For hour after hour, the fugitives poured over the long bridge in one continuous stream, increasing by their haggard looks and their wild words the general panic. The rain fell in torrents. It was whispered about that the government despaired of saving Washington and that a steamer waited with her fires lit to carry off the president and suite. The excited crowds that thronged the avenue swayed to and fro in the hotels, caught up in every rumor that fear or treason set afloat. It was said that Washington, in any event, would be captured within 48 hours. Then the story went that the advancing enemy could be seen from Arlington Heights, that Baltimore had risen, that communication with the North had been cut off, that the government was already seeking safety in flight. Treason, at first whispered, was soon talked openly. A reign of general terror seemed impending. Men began to suspect each other. No one knew whom to look up to. It was felt that, in this crisis, what was most wanted was a military leader, for General Scott, though repenting his fatal acquiescence in the advance on Bull Run, was unable, from physical infirmity, to meet the pressing demands of the hour. A younger hand was needed. A younger hand at the helm. At last, in one of the public rooms, someone suggested McClellan. The hint was taken up by acclamation. It passed from mouth to mouth. It ran through the streets. It flashed over the telegraph wires, and at once the nation breathed freely again. When it was announced in the great cities that the conqueror of Western Virginia had been called to command the Army of the Potomac, stocks rose immediately. The masses of the people remembered with enthusiasm that McClellan, alone of all the loyal generals, had as yet defeated the rebels, while men of more reflection saw in the masterly strategy which had won at Rich Mountain and at Beverly the highest auguries for the future. It was not, so went the talk of the hour, that he had won these victories, but it was the way in which he had won them that was so encouraging. He had made no parade of preparations. He had dealt in no vain boasts of crushing rebellion at a blow, but he had organized his forces. He had matured his plans. He had drawn his net gradually around his foe. And then, when everything was ready, he had suddenly thrown off his appearance of inaction, rushed in from all quarters on the enemy, and finished the work at a stroke. If he could only repeat on a larger scale the campaign of Philippi, the Republic, men said, could still be saved. Simultaneously with the news of his appointment, the North rose again like one man as after Sumter, Fort Sumter. Some of the returning regiments enlisted in a body. All along the great highways, far over the prairies of the West, up in the mountains of New Hampshire, by the lakes of New York, and on the hills of Pennsylvania, the drumbeat, the old flag was hung out, and men came thronging to the rescue of their country. In that hour, there was no talk of party. The only cry was, "Stand by the Union." every heartbeat with a sterner resolution than before. While the newly summoned general was speeding along on express trains to Washington, the great North was rising to follow him with a noise like many thunders. So there you have the story of the rise of Major General George Brinton McClellan from the conqueror, the hero of West Virginia, to the commander of the Union's Army of the Potomac. Of course, there was more to come, 1862, but in 1861, in this moment in time, he reigned supreme. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.